Now, with the integration of VBT into the annual plan, basically all you're doing is you're placing the percentages, and that's it. It's just a different way of dictating the load. It's not changing anything else. The way that I look at things is that with anatomical adaptation phase, velocity is irrelevant. There's going to be a large range of motion. It's low intensity. It's slow movement. It's trying to restore the range of motion to the joint. It's irrelevant. You're stupid if you do that. Put velocity on there for it. Well, you're not stupid. It's just I don't see the point currently. I always reserve the right to change my mind at a later date. Hypertrophy and endurance. Well, if we're looking at that, hypertrophy, especially if we're looking at indiscriminate hypertrophy, it's all related to time under tension and total volume. So then that relates the velocity to be irrelevant once again. Now, the caveat to that is if we were looking at selective hypertrophy, and we'll get to that here in a little bit. Working for absolute strength, looking at that 0.5 meters per second on down. The only times that I utilize velocity for strength work is whenever I'm dealing with somebody that might be dealing with a lot of outside stressors. So I want to make sure that they're utilizing the appropriate load so that we're not just saying 80%, 60% and giving them I'm going to give them the 0.8 meters per second. And then again, I also might look at the velocity loss for them. With the power, I typically break it down into strength, speed, or speed strength and train appropriately. Now with velocity loss is all it is it's stopping whenever you drop below a certain cutoff. Some people like to use a percentage value. It's like, well, whenever you are down to 90% of your best repetition, we're going to stop the set. Some people like to do an absolute value. I tended to do absolute values, but that was just my personal preference. There's some work, and we'll look at some here momentarily from Pareja Blanco that looked at utilization of 20 versus 40% of velocity loss and what the physiological adaptations were. Whenever we use velocity loss, it leads to a higher quality of work, which also can lead to selective hypertrophy. Now, if we think about Werner Gunther, who was the world champion in the shot put from Switzerland, and that almost sounds like a oxymoronical statement, a shot put world champion from Switzerland. But if we look back at him and we think about the biopsy that was done on him, whenever he had won the world championship, he had around 70% of his total fiber size was type 2 fibers, which we'd expect. But if we looked at the actual number of what those muscle fibers were, we saw that it was actually inverted. He was only 37% type 2. The rest was type 1. Now, how did that happen? Well, if you think back to the Werner Gunther's videos on training, you saw how much explosive work he did. So he had just a tremendous amount of selective hypertrophy. Also, from dealing with the time, I'm not going to say that there weren't other factors involved that helped that selective hypertrophy, but definitely the training that he did enabled that to occur. So we look here at this paper by Pareja Blanco, and basically what we see is that cross-sectional area did increase for everybody. But if we look at the percentage by fiber type, done with the ATPA's staining, whenever we're looking at the percent fiber type, we see that our type 2A fibers increased by about 5%, and our type 1 fibers decreased by 2%. If we look at the other isozymes, we would expect that from any training, these 2X and 2AX would transition to 2A. The 2C is a transitional between 1 and 2, and we see that it is leaning more towards the type 2. And so we're seeing our type 2A fibers are increasing in our percentage of cross-sectional area. Now, what can VBT do for you? Well, basically, it can replace some of the percentage-based training. It helps to prevent fatigue, which will help prevent overtraining.